Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak here tonight. I am planning to talk for about 30 minutes, more or less, and hopefully there'll be time therefore to have some to and fro and some conversation about what I'm talking about tonight and about related matters, perhaps as they relate to conditions in your country, as well as in mine. I think it's very important to have some degree of an exchange. It's very easy to talk about participatory media and then make a break for the exit without taking any questions. So I'm not going to do that tonight. One thing worth noting before we start is that most of you won't probably ask questions, and you certainly won't have a chance to talk at the kind of length that I'm going to talk. And I think we should always be aware of the structural inequalities in various media forms. This meeting is much more egalitarian than a news broadcast, for example. You do have a chance to respond in real time in such a way that the audience is aware of your response. But notice that when you speak from the floor, the experience is very different from speaking up here. Right? I have a license to speak, supposedly. And that gives me an advantage. I find talking from the floor much more stressful than talking from here. And these inequalities and these disparities of power, which are built into the structure, obviously become much more pronounced when we think of, for example, the broadcast form, where you can at most click the television, but the rest of the audience will be blindly unaware of your taking issue with what's being said on the news. And so my overriding concern, I think, is to try and reduce inequality in the field of communications. The idea is to give the vast majority of people a broadly equal power to shape the content of the public sphere, such that their collective power is much greater than the kinds of concentrated power that we have at the moment, who at the moment pretty much monopolise decisions about what makes it into the public space. I'm thinking here obviously of media owners, journalists, elected politicians, and so on. My intent is democratic in the sense that I want to put the demos, the system body, at the centre of decision making. That's to say, I'd like to see a situation where the content of the media becomes a collective achievement and a shared possession of the people who ultimately rely on it. This entails a very fundamental challenge to those who currently control public speech. It's not a notion that they feel comfortable with, and they will respond with a range of criticisms that perhaps we can talk about later. And they are, of course, by definition, very well placed to shut down or resist discussion about the fundamentals of power within the media, and to recreate what they do or redescribe what they do as the workings of a professional ethic or as an uncomplicated reflection of an objective reality. So what I thought I'd do is start with some historical remarks on the nature of the relationship between power and knowledge from the early 19th century coming forward into the present day. Then I want to talk in a little more detail about the current situation, the emergence of the digital form and the ways in which digital is displacing broadcast as the dominant mode by which we receive information. and the kinds of reactions that's provoking from the existing media and also from state structures. And then I want to talk about two kinds of response to what is widely understood to be a crisis in the media, a commercial crisis, and a crisis of plausibility to a certain extent. A set of responses which I will unfairly categorise on the one hand as neoliberal and on the other hand as revolutionary or deep reformist if you prefer. But I would say that it is revolutionary what I propose in that it lays the conditions at least for a much broader structural transformation of society. If you do want to make radical changes to political economy, it seems to me there is no hope of doing so in a reasonably orderly fashion without first transforming the operations and the content of the public sphere. Certainly one could imagine violent rupture of various kinds, but if our intention is to create a sustainable and reasonably just political and social order, it can only be achieved, it seems to me, on the basis of a reformed public opinion. So, historical overview, very, very quickly. In the early part of the 19th century through towards the end of the 19th century, you have media which is by and for elites. The paradigmatic example would be something like the Times newspaper in London, which is quite unreflectingly, is a ruling class newspaper. It is written by members of the ruling class, it is edited by members of the ruling class, and it is read by members of the ruling class. It's too expensive for most people, it doesn't write for most people, and shades of its elite pretensions survive into the 20th century. Peter Jay was a columnist on the Times, who was once asked by a copy editor what he meant in a particular column, and he said, "I write my column for 3 people, none of whom are you." And so, one thing one should note, I think, is the conservative nature of media outlets, the conservative nature of media forms. These elite media survive in something like their original form, but are supplemented, I think, as elite media in the 20th century by things like think tanks and various forms of social organisation, if you like, which provide what the old elite media used to provide, which is essentially a closed circuit for elite conversation, elite refinement of ideas, and the elite discovery of shared projects. As we progress through the 19th century, you see the emergence of mass electorates, and with them mass media which at the outset are characterised really by having two important elements. Firstly, commercial media, which survive and thrive in the marketplace, and do so increasingly through their access to advertising funds, so they grow in lockstep with the growth of the consumer society. And you also have party newspapers, with the emergence of particularly social democratic but also religiously based mass parties in Europe. You start to see the emergence of an important party political media system. In my country, this is perhaps slightly less developed than in parts of continental Europe, but for a long time the trade union movement had a controlling share in a daily newspaper called the Daily Herald, which was the largest English language newspaper in the country and probably in the world, right up until the time of its closure in the late 60s. As a sidebar, the Daily Herald changed names and changed owners and re-emerged as the Sun newspaper, which was part of the News International media empire. And this reflects a broader decline in the party press throughout the 20th century. And the key reason for that, I think, is the rise of broadcast as the dominant media technology. The political class discovered that they can reach a broad electorate without recourse to party media. They can appear on radio and television and thereby short-circuit the need to engage in potentially messy conversations with party members and party employees employed in the media about the content of policy. And so the decline of the party media reflects, I think, a broader decline in the mass party form as new technology allows political leaders to reconstitute themselves as media personalities, as media properties, who can speak apparently directly to the media. It's also worth noting that the broadcast media, in and of its nature, given that it relied on access to scarce broadcast capabilities, or scarce access to the airwaves and the relevant frequencies, broadcast media were always much more closely integrated with state administration than was true of the print media. This has important implications in the United States, for example, where during the 1930s the print media are overwhelmingly hostile to the New Deal and to the innovations in government that Roosevelt is pushing through in response to the Depression. The infant radio industry is much more willing to host New Deal politicians, including Roosevelt, and is much more sympathetic to, as it were, the state project, the federal state project, which, as we know, had social democratic characteristics, albeit of a problematic kind. And I think you can reasonably say that this hospitality towards the state, and the executive of the state in particular, reflected the structural vulnerability of broadcasters to, how one might say, muscular regulation. The way that the American broadcast system develops is that licenses are given basically free to private interests, with the implicit understanding that certain conventions have to be observed. And there's a very interesting quote which I think captures the sense in which the broadcast media are integrated into the state from a very early stage in the United States. In 1982, the National Security Council published a memorandum talking about, essentially about the role of the communications system in the formation and execution of national security policy. And that memorandum states, the nation's domestic and international telecommunications resources, including commercial, private and government-owned, are, quote, essential elements in support of US national security policy and strategy. So, during the broadcast regime, and as I'll argue, during the emerging digital regime, the notion that there is a clear line to be drawn between the private sector and the public sector is essentially a fantasy. It's a mutually useful fantasy. I would argue that it's in fact central to the way that broadcast and later digital media achieve the condition of plausibility in the English-speaking world. But when the state talks to itself, it's under no illusions that supposedly private media, supposedly private telecommunications resources are instruments of state policy and are to be treated as such. And part of the way that confidence the state has about its ability to control the private media comes down to the structural dependence of private media owners on the government for a favourable regulatory environment and access to the airwaves via the licensing system. So the broadcast regime that emerges with radio, and which is reinforced and in many ways expanded by television, has been framed in important respects since the 1990s. And the most obvious reason for that is the emergence of the internet in general and the World Wide Web in particular. So the centre of gravity in communications has been shifting from the nightly news to either the BBC's front page or the most visited websites in a particular country, and most centrally perhaps to Google's front page. So Google is becoming the most important player in the global information system, with some important exceptions. And as that shift in centre of gravity has taken place, we've seen a growing interest in the operations of the digital media being expressed by the state, and particularly by the secret state. Now, the nightmare that the state and indeed the private media owners have is that this technology will, as it were, live up to its billing, that it will allow unmediated and easy communication between citizens in a way that undermines the power of gatekeepers and undermines the ability of the state to frame and limit conversation in ways that keep its prerogatives intact by keeping them obscure. Now this is obviously something which, while they talk about it, they're determined to stop. So while I think the technology makes change inevitable, the form that the change takes is very much up for grabs. And I think the most important event, if you like, in the last 12 months in thinking about media communications has been the so-called Snowden affair. The fact that a huge number of classified documents which relate to particularly the American but also the UK intelligence apparatus' relationships with the digital media shows what should have been obvious to us, as it were, a priori, which is that the state cannot envisage a future where it is not able to exercise decisive and secret control over the communication regime in which it operates. By the state, I mean, in quite a broad sense, the dominant economic and political interests that form state policy and determine the nature of concepts like national security. It seems to me at a moment like this we have, if we are Democrats, a responsibility to pay very close attention to what is happening and try and formulate a response which does not fall into kinds of pre-prepared dichotomies that will be made available in the existing mainstream. One of the frustrations that I have about movements for media reform in my country is that a great number of initiatives are being undertaken which seek to, for example, strengthen state regulation of the private media, or that seek to limit the market share that can be secured by any one player. These are both essentially, it seems to me, neoliberal interventions. They are attempts to use state power to make the market work more efficiently and to remove from the market some of its less appealing features. And the obvious counterpower to these sorts of efforts at reform is, as it were, the other hand of neoliberalism, which is to say that market forces will do the work and that state regulation is to be resisted at all costs. I would emphasise that state control of the commanding heights of the media system has always been a given in certainly the broadcast regime, and it's certainly what we see emerging in the digital regime. So the ambition is to reproduce the conditions of broadcast under the rubric, or under the reign of digital technology. We can already see now outline the sorts of techniques that the state is rehearsing to achieve this commanding control of public discourse. Some of these techniques are borrowed from corporate public relations industry. So you see, for example, the state becoming much more interested in identifying opinion formers and influencers, and either co-opting them, converting them into stakeholders of one kind or another, or else discrediting them by more or less underhand means. So there, as it were, is the neoliberal response. In some ways it's an anachronistic response because presented with a commercial crisis in the traditional media, presented with growing evidence of state infiltration and manipulation of the digital space. It's looking to reform newspapers, it's looking to change the way that print media operate. And there is a sense in which we're fighting last century's battles. But I think that one thing I would stress, I think, in terms of the Snowden revelations, is that it highlights once again the absurdity of thinking that private property is a meaningful safeguard against the power of the state. The idea that a private media sector can somehow resist the state in important respects and thereby act as a shield for the public more generally has been proven once again to be a fiction. It was a fiction in the mid-century in the United States, as became obvious in the revelations after Watergate, where it became clear that the print media were, to a very large extent, wholly owned subsidiary of the CIA in important respects. And I think it's becoming fairly clear now that the emerging media are being subordinated to the national security agenda. And they are doing so for very similar reasons to the broadcasters. Large corporations are intensely vulnerable to heavy-handed regulation, to investigation, to the operations of state power. And the state is in a position essentially to blackmail them into doing exactly what it wants, when it wants. I think as well that the Snowden revelations have shattered the naive model of network technology to the extent that it was ever plausible. The idea that, as the head of Twitter said, Twitter operates much as the Athenian agora does, by allowing endless cross conversations without central direction. That has been revealed to be a nonsense, it seems to me, in that every effort is being expended to ensure that doesn't happen. Okay, so how are we doing for time? Okay, let me talk very quickly about the overlap, if you like, between the Google business model and the state agenda. The idea that business models would serve state functions is a long-established one. A British newspaper editor called Paul Dacre once explained to an audience that his newspaper had to be allowed to pry into private life and to print scandal in order to subsidise its account of the political world. So the deal with politicians was, allow us to ruin people's lives for entertainment, and we'll use some of the surplus to subsidise an account of the political which would otherwise not attract an audience. So if you want depth of coverage for your bit of show business, you have to give us a free hand with our business model. So business models and service to the state have always been entwined, and this was the justification, as I say, for the popular press in the United Kingdom. If you look at the business model of Google and Facebook, what they are looking to do is they have a twofold agenda. They want to gather information about people, and they want to use that information for the purposes of manipulation. They want to know more and more about their audiences and more about their users so that they can sell that information to advertisers. And the promise they make to advertisers is that if you pay us a premium, you'll be able to get people to behave like obedient consumers more efficiently through our communication networks. And you can very, very clearly see how that capability to both surveil and to manipulate has important possibilities, important attractions for those who wish to retain control of, as it heights, the formation of national security policy and the establishment of boundaries about acceptable debate in matters of political economy. We're in sight, I think, at the moment now of a wholly managed public sphere. The technology exists to make surveillance and manipulation both highly effective and almost imperceptible. Short of mega leaks, short of huge dumps of secret documents, we can go about our business confident that we're able to communicate freely with one another, confident that we're not being censored, while in fact being subject to all manner of very subtle manipulation. Some of those examples are videos, for example, on YouTube, which are, that have problematic content, won't necessarily be taken down, but the counter will be reset. So 1 million views will become 13 views overnight. And then 1 million views the next day will become 12 views the day after that. So you can see very, very simple methods by which these technologies can be tweaked. Similarly with the algorithms used to flag up things that you might be interested in. At the moment we have this idea that if I like this, then I'll be recommended this, which is similar. It's perfectly possible to imagine a situation where if I like this, I definitely won't hear about that. These algorithms can cut both ways. So, that's where I think we are at the moment, and that's where I think I have a degree of frustration with some of the conversations about media reform that we currently have, which seem to me to fall into a fairly traditional model of state regulation on the one hand, and a free and unencumbered private sector on another, when in fact the distinction between the private and the public sector in the media is not non-existent, but it is highly problematic. So what does deep reform of the media look like? And how do we go about creating a media system that is not subject to covert manipulation, and that is not something that looks like a plural system while not being a plural system? How do we actually achieve real pluralism? And how do we achieve a public sphere in which all points of view can be given a hearing, and if found to be valid or if found to be factually adequate, can achieve purchase on the formation of policy? How do we create public media, in other words, as opposed to mass media? The proposal I make in The Return of the Public, I give the name public commissioning, and it's the idea that when subsidies are directed towards journalism in public interest, those subsidies should be subject to substantial public control. So it's a fairly simple principle that taxpayers' money that is used to support journalism for the public should be allocated to journalists on the basis of the express will of self-organising publics. That's essentially my argument. It's an argument that is greeted with incredulity and horror by a broad range of left liberal opinion as well as by right-wingers. I was at one meeting and I said essentially what I've just said, and a liberal academic in the United Kingdom said, almost with a kind of involuntary explosion, she said, they'll just want stories about Rihanna. That was the immediate kind of fear, was that once you give this power to the general public, they will use it essentially for frivolous or irrelevant ends. point of doing it, it seems to me, is that the results will be unpredictable. It's not at all clear to me how publics will emerge, what form they will take, what organising principles will govern their formation. Some groups might organise on class grounds, they might organise on geographical grounds, they might organise on the basis of ethnicity or on the basis of identity. Or they might, as is more likely it seems to me, organise on a mixture of all of the above. We are none of us all one thing. So we could, I think, hope to see the emergence of varied groups with varying agendas, varying degrees of purchase on reality as well, who would nevertheless be in a position to fund investigation, fund analysis, that would then find its way into the broad channels of communication. Now, I think my thinking on this has been conditioned to some extent by the existence of the BBC in my country. I can talk a little bit about it, about the BBC, but essentially we have in my country a very powerful state broadcaster which to some extent convenes the mainstream. It is a space where very broadly shared descriptions of the world are produced and then promulgated. It has its origins as much, I think, in the late Empire, the late British Empire, as it does in the early days of parliamentary democracy in Britain. And I think in some ways it is perhaps the last great institutional innovation of the British Empire. And part of its success is the fact that it is not understood as such by the people that it serves. Nevertheless, we have a powerful state broadcaster in my country which could, with some tweaks, be made into a forum where the products of publicly commissioned journalism could be shared and could be given an opportunity to reach large audiences. This is not to say that everything produced by public commissioned journalism will be worthy or factually adequate, but it does mean that areas which are currently under-investigated for structural reasons would be open to an open cry system. The most obvious example is the financial sector, which is very powerful in my country. Financial reporting in the years before the crisis was, I think, is broadly accepted, wholly inadequate. No one was describing the bare outlines of what was happening in a way that made any sense or that could inform the public in any meaningful way about the risks that were being taken with their money on their behalf. Until we establish something like public commissioning, power nexuses of intellectual as much as financial power, like the financial sector, will remain more or less impervious to public understanding. So that's one of the main reasons I am so eager to see a system of public commissioning, as I say, not because I think that everyone will suddenly become obsessed with the intricacies of the financial markets, but because there's no other way in which we can possibly hope to have any serious and sustained journalism about the financial sector in my country, and I suspect in yours. Maybe just a couple of words in conclusion. My country is incredibly stable, it's infuriatingly stable, but it is now in the grips of something like the early stages, perhaps, of a constitutional crisis, because the second largest country in Great Britain, Scotland, is seriously contemplating becoming independent. And this has created an opportunity for people to start discussing the fundamentals of political economy, the fundamentals of the relationship between political economy and constitutions. Constitution building is becoming a subject of quite general interest in Scotland, and is likely to remain so for at least the next few months. And maybe after that, when you have a situation of turbulence like that, ideas for reform which would otherwise be ridiculed and dismissed become available as resources for a public that is motivated to think about what could be different. The problem I think that many of us find in Europe is that when we talk outside quite small circles of activists, most people they're quite hesitant to have the conversation because they think there's no point. There's no point in thinking about what society might be like. There's no point in thinking about what radical change might be like. But in unpredictable ways and in different places, you see this potential for rupture, and the process is very similar. People who were apolitical begin to be political. They begin to engage with political ideas in a much more energetic and positive way, and certain things that would have been considered impossible become common sense. So everything that we do in Europe, on whatever scale that we do it, because of this technology that we have access to, because of the growing ties between different European countries. 20 years ago, it would have been unusual, much more unusual for someone from England to come and talk to an audience in Slovenia. The ties, similarly, 20 years ago, it would be unlikely that a Slovenian intellectual would have become a popular figure in my country. So these new ties mean that experiments, innovations in Slovenia or in Croatia can inform what activists think of doing or try to do or actually achieve in Scotland. And similarly, what happens in Scotland or in Scandinavia can inform progressive movements in southern and central Europe, and so on and so forth. In what I hope will be a process, a gradual but accelerating process of constructing a Europe from below, a Europe that is not transfixed by Brussels and by the Brussels institutions, but is interested in creating horizontal ties and forming and performing new experiments in social organisation and developing them together in what I hope will be a replacement for an EU that doesn't, to my mind, work. So there I think I'll stop talking.
I'd like to thank Dan for his interesting and, to use Sasha's words from yesterday, enlightening lecture. Now I want to invite the public into the discussion. If you want to make a comment or if you want to ask a question, now is your time. Anybody?
I never know how to end these things. So I could just stop. So I could just I could get up and do different endings. More arm waving, more pointing out the window. But anyway, so it's really difficult to ask questions. I know. I hate asking questions. I kind of hyperventilate when I'm in the audience. Like the idea of it's but now I can't shut up. Isn't that weird?
Perhaps
Hello. I have a question regarding, if I understood correctly, regarding this position. You said that people are organized as in advance, and this public commissioning idea would give them the opportunity to demand their voice to be heard, or something like that. But this means, I think the position is wrong, because this means that we presuppose that people are already organized, and we know this is not the truth, because those who are organized are already very powerful, already have all the access to the media and whatever other sources. So I think it's the other way around. I mean, first to achieve these goals which you mentioned, I think it's important first to organize people. And thus, by organizing, I mean organize and politicize them, this certain group, which would then only be able to demand their voice to be heard or propose relevant topics to be discussed in the media. Otherwise, you only have a mass of individuals who kind of attach themselves to already existing organizations, which I mentioned already have the power to influence the opinion, or simply don't get their voice to be heard because others are more powerful, because others manage to gain more votes. So that's the first question.
Okay. I mean, what I don't want to suggest is that we have already as it were, a fully formed plural civil society that is ready to leap on this mechanism in order to make the media reflect this already flourishing civil society. I think to some extent I agree with your analysis that if this was introduced tomorrow, it would tend to be dominated by those who currently dominate the other mechanisms of decision because they're better organised. They have two problems. Firstly, there aren't very many of them, and I am proposing, as it were, €1, 1 vote, right? Sorry, 1 vote, €1. So one citizen has as much power to fund journalism as another, whether the president or anyone else. And the second problem they have is that their account of reality is factually flawed, right? And the reason that it survives, it seems to me, is that it's not effectively challenged. Okay, so in my country, every night or every time there's a financial crisis, or every time, which is quite a long time, economists and journalists go on the news and they say things about the economy that just aren't true, just factually not true, and then they're actually directly contrary to what official institutions are saying to themselves and to much smaller elite publics, right? So once you make this mechanism widely available, yes, it's true. I think that much of the money will be initially captured by existing organised groups, but the process is iterative. It happens again and again and again. And if even a tiny minority are able to reach the mainstream with a critique of political economy or social organisations of various kinds, that, it seems to me, will be the basis on which you can expect more funds to flow in that direction, and to see more people begin to organise themselves in support of that kind of analysis. So the mechanism itself helps to create publics. It's the existence of a public power that creates the public. Before you have democracy, you don't have a demos. You have what they call a mob, an ochlos, right? Solon, that, mythically creates democratic institutions, and by doing so creates a demos. A problematic demos in lots of ways. But it's the institutional form, it seems to me, that makes possible the kinds of public organisation that we'd all like to see. It also makes possible forms of social organisation we may not like to see. People will organise themselves in conservative coalitions or in reactionary ways. But again, I think that the overwhelming problem they have is that their account of reality doesn't fit the facts.
I disagree here, because this again presupposes that yesterday you said that these, for example, reactionary groups or even fascists, whatever, should also get the right to be heard, etc. And then you said as if other people would recognize they're wrong, so this would kind of marginalize them all over again. But if that were true, then we wouldn't have tabloids or even fascism in the first place. Don't you agree?
No, I don't. I think it's very important to understand that fascism is a creation of dominant political and economic interests in a country.
Yeah, but you said that they would recognize these facts to be wrong, so that's why they wouldn't listen to them anymore, and they would be marginalized. That's how I understood you yesterday.
But yeah, that's exactly what I think would happen. Yeah, but because what they're saying is wrong. Right? What they're saying is factually inaccurate.
But that didn't stop anyone from not winning their arguments, even if they were wrong, and winning their power.
No, but what a successful fascist takeover requires almost complete domination of the media space.
This is an extreme example, yeah. I agree.
But it's a very important example because, fascism is a lie. It is based on a lie. And Lies are only plausible if they're not challenged, right? And the way that fascists respond to challenge is with violence, because they can't win an argument, right? And they can only achieve the condition of plausibility if they can silence any other voice, even silence like internal voices. So, in my country, we have a kind of proto-fascist strand in our mass media. And there's a strand of coverage which uses fascist tropes about like the irredeemable villainy of Islam and similar themes which have a long and disgusting pedigree. And they survive in the particular media system that we have, because they're not subject to meaningful challenge.
But they are, but liberals, because liberals...
No, because liberal newspapers cater to different audiences. They actually, liberal newspapers in my country cater to richer audiences than the kinds of readerships that are exposed to this kind of film. So, liberal newspapers tell their readers, you're not like those stupid poor people, you don't believe silly things like that, you believe the things that we believe. And they have an interest in differentiating themselves from the tabloid press. So the mechanisms of the market, it seems to me, depend on maintaining these pools of ignorance or misapprehension, which would be challenged much more effectively, it seems to me, by a media system where these arguments could be brought into the mainstream and then critiqued. Because they survive in isolation. The BBC does not challenge the quasi-fascist elements in the print press. It doesn't do it. It doesn't see it as that's its role. It sees its role is to reproduce a balanced account according to its own light of what constitutes the social. But that doesn't include a sustained critique of the right-wing press. If you want a sustained critique of the right, then you need something like democratic control of the media. Because that's the only way you'll get these debates out into the general sphere where they matter. Right? Because people who read right-wing newspapers, they've been told lots of stories about the state broadcaster and how it's a liberal plot and so on. And there's no dialogue between these two institutions.
And the idea is that the counter-arguments would be strong enough to eliminate the reactionary...
I don't think it's a question of eliminating them. I think that these things are... We all have a seed of something kind of revolting in us, and this stuff can always break out. It would be a mistake to think that we're any of us immune to some version of as it were, the fascist imaginary. These things, they have some sort of purchase on us, always. And they're always going to be in the background. But certainly in my country, I would like to see the influence of these ideas much reduced. And I think that the way you do that is by debating them, by engaging with them. And engaging with them in such a way that you're not engaging with them, you're engaging with their audiences. Because, and then this is where I get to the kind of the hard line of my commitment, as it were, in that I am committed to the Enlightenment principle that people, all things being equal, and that's a big all things being equal, but all things being equal, people love the truth, and they want to be free.
Okay, but to complete more, and I'm done now, I think that the ideology doesn't operate only at the level of discourse, so I don't think it's enough just to debate these ideas and position them one against each other and see which one is more correct, more right, and which one wins. So I have a problem with this approach, maybe.
How else would you see the ideology? I mean, how else would you see a play of ideology working?
Well, ideology is being perpetuated by the media, of course, but it's just one outlet for the ideology. Of course, it's being reproduced in schools already, or even I don't know, faculties, whatever, media, state, such. And so it's not enough to grasp it just at this level of discourse.
No, I completely concede that.
And of course, it's rooted in the economy. I mean, the main point is that.
And certainly what I'm proposing is not, it's not going to automatically lead to changes in the economy or changes in the structures of education and so on. But again, it seems to me if you want to change the apparatus of the state, if you want to change the organisation of political economy, I don't know how one could conceive of doing that without establishing a different model for constructing, as it were, the common sense, like what people generally think of as being kind of broad.
I agree.
And it leaves I'm completely unsure whether this will work, right? But what I do know is that what we have won't, and that this at least gives us a chance to move forward to much more, much further reaching changes in the ideological apparatus, changes in the economy and so on.
Sure. And you hand a strong organization. Okay. I'm done. Sorry.
Yeah, no, definitely. But you see, this will keep the party form honest.
Sorry?
This will keep the party form honest.
Sure. So, like I said, hand in hand, yeah. Not one, only one is not enough. Sure.
Okay, Sasha, you had one question?
Yeah, well, a lot of times when you saw proposals for democratization of a lot of times when we saw proposals for democratization of the media, there was so strong resistance from the professional communicators, not only from those who have very strong vested interest of keeping the public ignorant, but from journalists and editors themselves. Now we are seeing some changes, at least in Slovenia, with the young, especially young, precarious journalists. I see a change, in questioning the system as a whole and also their role in the system. So I basically have a twofold question. So what to do with the resistance from the professional communicators, and might this, let's say, popularization of journalists that is more and more a reality in the industry be a sort of an opening for ideas of radical reform?
Well, I think the situation is very ambiguous, because as people become more precarious, they often become more cautious, perhaps. But we talked about how over the last few days we've talked to people and we've talked about how powerful the media is in setting the agenda, and in a sense how attractive communications is as a field if you're a young person who wants to make your mark. So it remains a focus for ambition, it seems to me, for a lot of young people. An awful lot more people are studying journalism than there are opportunities to be a journalist, as far as I can tell. And there is a question, I think, about what kinds of calculation those people will make. Do they want to train for a media system that doesn't really have a place for them, or that has a place for them on very constrained terms? That it will want them to produce gossip pieces for Gawker or lists for BuzzFeed, or the kind of hyper commercial journalism that is one of the few growth areas. Or will they be willing to entertain the possibility of doing journalism that is more serious, but also can contribute to a society's progress? It's an open question. Young people, it seems to me, are often just infuriatingly optimistic. If they're told that they've got a 1 in 100 chance of getting a job, they're all going to be the number one. They're all going to be that 1 in 100.
It's not 1 in 1,000.
It's not 1 in 1,000, exactly. Those odds are good, right? One thing I would say is that precariousness is reaching into the established ranks of the profession as well. It's not just a question of people in the early stages of their career or before they become journalists. People who have been in journalism for 20 years are realizing that things are not as stable in their workplace as perhaps they imagined. And they are beginning, I think, to entertain the possibility that something is structurally wrong with the society that has up till now treated them very well. It's very difficult to persuade someone who's making good money and has enjoyable working conditions, gets to do pretty much what they like. It's very difficult to persuade those people that there might be something wrong with society in general. But journalists, I think, as a profession, are beginning to see the cracks. They're beginning to see that the kinds of precariousness that other people have had inflicted on them are now in their newsroom. They're noticing that they're not young journalists being hired, they're interns. They're noticing that their terms and conditions aren't improving as much or at all. I'm waffling slightly. I don't know what impact precariousness and economic crisis will have on journalists' willingness to entertain the possibility of deep reform. I formulated this idea in part as my attempt to exact my revenge on the editorial class. I was an editor for 10 years, and I sat in editorial meetings trying to get progressive projects through, being met with a wall of incomprehension and indifference from very well-fed people who just didn't care about progressive issues, or thought, more importantly, thought that the public didn't. And I wanted to open up that editorial process to wider participation, because I don't think that editors as a group can possibly do the job that they think they're doing. They can't possibly fulfill the social function that they claim for themselves. So in the end, this will be achieved over the resistance of professional decision makers in the media. I don't expect that we'll wipe out the editorial function at all, but I think that we will change it if what is currently a closed process of editorial decision making is paralleled by an open process of public deliberation. If you create that alternative possibility, you create a chance for journalists to work for the public directly rather than working for editors. And you make, it seems to me, you make editors pay attention to what the public is doing. Editors at the moment carry a vision in their head of the reader as essentially as an idiot. And they enjoy the fact, they take sensual pleasure in knowing more than their readers. Right? The experience of superiority is a great intoxicant. That's what it is to have power. And that's what editors have, they have power. And of course they'll resist any diminution of that power. Any hint that their special powers of discernment are not necessary or they're inadequate.